Hello everyone, I will be taking the session on climate finance architecture. My name is Navraj Pradhan and I am the regional lead looking after the climate finance portfolio at ADPC headquartered in Bangkok. So the objectives of this session is to provide you with technical knowledge on how climate finance flows through various channels from global to bilateral to multilaterals. Then it also aims to dive deeper into the finance architecture itself from these global scenarios, the financing gaps and scenarios published by some of these think tanks tracking climate finance. And I also aim to give you some key take-home messages and opportunities going into the future. The first is the global finance architecture itself, and we all know it is ever complex and always evolving. And the climate finance architecture has become so complex over the past 25 years because of dozens of national, regional, international, public and private sector climate funds that have been created. Each new fund responds to needs and gaps and existed at that time. But again, this has led to a rather complicated system, so I'll take you through that. So the second is we will look more at focus on multilateral climate funds and how they have been sort of important in this whole space of climate finance when you look at it more from an architecture perspective. Third is we will touch a bit on bilateral funds and how they're also filling in this space on the overall climate finance architecture going into countries and how they're funding these. Finally, I will dive more down deep into adaptation fund. As we know, this has been a financing gap in the past 5 to 10 years and how it is important we go and focus on this as we move towards the next 5 or 10 years. Now let's look closely at the global finance, climate finance architecture. Now, before I start, climate finance itself, as we all know, we are climate and development professionals. It was the elephant in the room at COP26 and was in COP27, and it will be so going into the upcoming COPs. And we know that climate finance discussions during these COP meetings often center on the level of funding provided by developed countries and the mechanisms for delivering and reporting on this funding. Now, the pledge to mobilize 100 billion a year in climate finance remains a central pillar of negotiations. But developed nations, we all know, are still falling short on both quantity and quality of financing. Again, despite this increase in climate finance flows over the years, there's still a significant financing gap in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement. The UN, as we know, estimates that an annual investment of about 1.6 trillion will be needed to implement the country NDCs, which are their plans to reduce GHG and adapt to the impacts of climate change. So basically, before I dive into it, I just wanted to reflect that climate finance is often framed as an issue of justice, with developed nations viewed as responsible for helping developing nations address climate change. Now, this slide, I would just like to highlight that the emergence of climate finance as a concept, so just giving you a chronology of it, in the development sector can be tracked back by UNFCCC, and which was actually established in 1992, so almost 3 decades back. However, it was only in the last decade, around 2010, that it started to get significant attention from policymakers, investors, and development organizations. And then, everyone has jumped in the bandwagon. It was this increased attention was driven by various growing concerns about the impacts of climate change, and we know it now this year even more so, with so many disasters and climate impacts occurring around the world. And then, the recognition of the potential economic opportunities associated with climate smart investments. So, addressing the finance and the climate finance mobilizing gap, not only because of GHG historical responsibility, but its links to the SDGs, what is defined in the Paris Agreement under the NDC specific plans to keep a cap of the world to below 2 degrees. It's defined, and I'm sure it's been talked about in other sessions and other global frameworks like the Sendai framework for DRR. The Convention on Biological Diversity talks about investments for conservation, and so on and so forth, like the Addis Ababa action area, which looks at financing resources. I am quite certain most of you have seen this figure. It is one of the most important and I think well defined channelizing of climate finance flows that have been shown at a global, from bilateral to multilateral, from non-UNFCCC mechanisms, and finally regional and national levels. This figure provides an overview of the whole climate global finance architecture, focusing particularly on public climate financing mechanisms and the types of climate finance available, from grants and concession loans to guarantees and private equity. The architecture also has differing structures of governance, modalities, and objectives. The proliferation of climate finance mechanisms increases the challenge of coordinating and accessing finance, as well as its monitoring. So while the transparency of climate finance program through multilateral initiatives is increasing, detailed information on bilateral initiatives, which you look at it from the top, so like from DFAT and all the other organizations, we look at ICI, NAMA facility, and so on and so forth. This bilateral information on regional national funds are often less and readily available. So that is how complex it is. Here, from this architecture itself, we will, in the next few slides, dive into what we call the UNFCCC financial mechanisms and how they are important, and also the non-UNFCCC financial mechanisms through the multilateral institutions. Way back at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009, this was when the $100 billion mark was committed to mobilize climate finance by 2020 to address the needs of developing countries. And we know that there have been ongoing debates and discussions about the adequacy, the effectiveness of climate finance in supporting the needs to developing countries. And these discussions are likely to continue at future climate negotiations, like I mentioned earlier. So the progress towards a $100 billion target, which is reflected by think tanks like OECD, have not been met, as you can see. So the OECD assessment is also one of the most generous interpretations of finance target possible, because it counts any and all public developed finance badged as climate, whereas in reality we know that almost half of the efforts to date are redirected or rebadged as aid, and much remains committed but not yet dispersed. So beyond the $100 billion public finance mechanisms, this slide will give you a perspective of the overall landscape on climate finance globally. So the blue ones that are reflected here are from public sources, and the orange ones are private sources, financing institutions. What I'm interested to show you are these two circles, and as you can see, most of them in the past decade of climate financing has focused on mitigation. So out of the 653 billion US dollars annual average, 91%, that is about 586, has been focused on mitigation financing. So this, of course, the major chunk of it, as you can look at it, is more looking at energy systems, investments in energy systems and transport. And you can see that only around 49% have been focused on adaptation, which is 9%. and that includes various industries, waste, buildings, infrastructure, and cross-sectoral. Like I mentioned earlier, from global climate finance architecture, we would look at a case focus on multilateral climate funds. Here we will look at the spectrum of climate finance, especially the multilateral climate finance at scale and thematic focus. So if you look at the blue ones, they're mitigation, then we have mitigation and adaptation, just mitigation, red plus only, and the yellow ones are the adaptation. Here I have tried to put a perspective on financing. If you look at it only from $1 billion and above, and the rest of it which don't have numbers are less than 1 billion. So if you look at it, the financing mechanisms like the UN RED are less than 1 billion. So, but it gives you in a bubble as to what the allocations and perspectives are over small to large scale. So the adaptation fund, like if you go into it, is around 1 billion. Looking at only adaptation financing, the Amazon fund is also around 1 billion, which is looking at mitigation, and so on and so forth. And as you move towards the larger chunks of climate finance mechanism, the GEF is about 4 billion, the Clean Technology Fund about 5.8 billion, and we all know that GCF holds about 11 billion. Again, not taking into perspective their second replenishment, which is moving forward from 2023 to 2027. But what I would like to highlight here in this slide is that the multilateral climate finance funds do face a number of challenges to realizing their full potential. And we've seen that over the last 2 decades, and even a decade, there have been a proliferation of bilateral, multilateral funds providing climate finance, each one responding to needs that emerged at different times. Among the multilateral climate finance funds, the result has been that there has been some overlapping of roles and duplication of efforts. Here I would like to highlight and just put into perspective the overall global finance landscape. And we saw that in the previous few slides, that it was 653 billion overall, and the mitigation financing from various private and public sector itself took 586 billion, and just 49 billion was adaptation finance. Now if you plot the big chunks of multilateral finance here, 11 billion GCF, 4 billion GEF, and 5.8 billion CTF, overall you would see that they don't even fit 3 to 6% of the overall global financing architecture. So I just wanted to put into perspective the multilateral compared to global overall climate finance architecture. Compared to the previous slide, where we see that multilateral climate finance fund flows are very small compared to the overall climate finance global landscape, by far we know that the largest sums of capital lie in the private sector, and aligning these investment funds with climate and sustainable development goals is also key. Although the multilateral finance is smaller in amount, public finance also plays a critical role, because it is the source over which policymakers can exert direct control, and it is essential for providing public goods and services that the private sector is unwilling or unable to support, which we also call in finance or climate finance terms de-risking the financing strategy. When deployed effectively, these multilateral public finance can catalyze private investments by stimulating markets, fostering innovation, and reducing risk. So multilateral climate finance funds play a key role in using international public finance to stimulate shifts in investments by other public and private finance institutions that are necessary to drive broader economic and social transformation. and only transformation at a global scale will be sufficient to reduce emissions and improve climate resilience in order to meet international climate and SDG goals. So therefore, it is important, although it is small, it is important, and it is important as these are linked to country NDCs and how we get into the global stock takes that are going to take place next year, and the second stage and the third stage as well. So to enhance climate action going forward, multilaterals also form a key piece and are central to climate finance funds. We've talked about the overlaps of the roles and duplications of multilaterals and how that reflects on impacts and transparency, something that I would like to highlight here. The total climate finance approval figures tell us very little about how effective this finance is. The actual impacts reported, through all these channels, and we know that all of them serve the UNFCCC and the targets to the Paris Agreement. So if you look at it from a perspective of how these funds are using the metrics or methods to assess the impacts, it is still not clear. Here I would like to particularly highlight two which have a question mark. One towards the far left, which is the Adaptation Fund established in 2009, and the other one, the GEF, which was established way back in 1991. The Adaptation Fund again faces criticisms on the portfolio level actual impacts that have not been reported in comparable formats. And similarly here, in the GEF as well, the portfolio level actual impacts have not been reported. However, the actual impacts reported across major of the multilateral climate funds, still 22, they say have included 36 million beneficiaries of the Adaptation Fund and 1.6 million beneficiaries for mitigation finance. And cross-cutting like GCF reaches another 10 million beneficiaries. So basically, whether they are reaching beneficiaries or reducing GHG emissions annually, this is something that has been looked into by policymakers who are raising questions about how to improve coherence and complementarity in responding to evolving developing country needs and the effectiveness. So these issues have led to debates in contributor countries regarding where to allocate public resources and recipient countries regarding which funds they prioritize their engagements with. Now we will look into bilateral funds and how in the overall global finance architecture, apart from multilateral funds, the bilateral funds also serve as a mechanism serving as investments or contributions from developed countries to developing countries. I would like to reflect on this table here, which shows that Japan, if you see, was by far the largest provider of climate finance, according to this data published by OECD, followed by Germany, France, the UK, and the US. So together, these 5 countries provided 70% of all donor finance recorded in the OECD's detailed figures. And if you look at the right side column, the largest recipients of countries were India, if you look at it from, and I would guess this is more because there were investments in renewable energy or energy related climate finance investment flows. Then you would see Bangladesh, Vietnam, the Philippines, and Thailand. Also together they received almost 21% of finance given by these donor countries. Now the last part of this session is looking at and focusing on the Adaptation Fund itself. Like I mentioned in the beginning of the session, how there has been a financing gap in the adaptation climate finance fund flows, and how it is important going into the future for the next 5 to 10 years in filling these gaps. And this is what we'll focus on in the next few slides. Here, I would like to highlight the UNEP Adaptation Gap Report, which was recently published in 2022. And the headlines really caught my eye. It says, "Too little, too slow. Climate adaptation failure puts the world at risk." And I think this is very concerning, and this is what I wanted to highlight here. So if you look at the time frame from 2021 to 2050, which is building the race to resilience or meeting net zero, it all fits in this time frame. And I think the UNEP have published this important report which needs to be reflected. So they've said from 2021 to 2023, the international adaptation finance flows are almost 5 to 10 times below the estimated needs, and the gap is widening. So this was something that I thought it would be important to highlight here. And the funding needed in the next 10 years from 2030 to 2040 is approximately about 160 to 340 billion. And the additional funding needed from the next 2040 to 2050 to meet the NAP and the NDC targets is 315 to 565 billion by 2050. Now, having said that, the report and different think tanks also say that the challenge is the financing gap for adaptation. But however, there are also significant opportunities associated with climate finance moving into the future, especially when you look at adaptation financing. This includes the potential to drive sustainable development and economic growth, as well as promote innovation and technological advances in the climate-related sectors. So scaling up future climate financing will require increased attention to addressing this gap and ensure that financial resources are directed towards the most and the vulnerable areas in terms of deploying the adaptation and finance technologies. Now, previously we talked about the opportunities of adaptation, and here I would just like to highlight a year or so back where in the World Economic Forum, in the race to resilience, they highlighted how the climate adaptation market is a 2 trillion market the private sector cannot ignore. And some of the figures here I would like to highlight are, again, these are big banks and private sectors that are coming up and are having interest in investments in financing the adaptation sector and filling this gap. So analysts from Bank of America have predicted that this will double to 2 trillion a year within the next 5 years. PricewaterhouseCoopers estimates that climate-focused startup investments has increased by nearly 3,750% in the last 6 years. And a research commissioned by the Climate KIC, based out of the UK, found that the adaptation economy was already worth 279 billion globally, with a forecast to grow at 11% per year. So you can see the messages from private sector and various technologies that are coming ahead in investing in adaptation and filling this gap. Now, the final part of the session are some key take-home messages as you go forward in this course, and I would like to highlight them here. Now, the current landscape of climate finance is the instruments are evolving. So the new financial instruments and approaches such as green bonds, blended finance, impact investing are also creating new opportunities for mobilizing climate finance. For example, green bonds have emerged as key instruments of climate finance, with issuance growing from 3 billion in 2012 to over 258 billion in 2020, according to Climate Bonds Initiative data. The impact investing, which involves investing in companies and projects with the intention of generating positive social and environmental impacts along with financial return has also grown in importance in recent years, with over 715 billion in assets under management as of 2020. The use of climate related risk assessments and stress tests by financial institutions has become more widespread, reflecting growing recognition of risks posed by climate change to financial stability and investment portfolios. So, going forward, it will be important to continue to innovate and explore new approaches to climate finance while also addressing these challenges and ensuring that finance is directed towards the most vulnerable countries. The final part of this session is to give you a perspective on the analysis and suggestions coming from various think tanks and organizations on the reforms of multilaterals, with changes in the shorter term, which is 2 to 5 years, focused on improving the coordination, the harmonization, and specialization, which is number one, which I'll talk about. And also looking at it on the longer term, like 4 to 8 years, and which funds need to be closed or consolidated. Again, these recommendations highlighted are not necessarily mutually exclusive, nor are they the only options worth considering. So I would like to get into this. Number one is the coordination itself among multilaterals, and then what is coming out is the process to coordinate between the funds, including national engagement. So let's take readiness itself as one coordination. So instead of having a readiness for GCF or adaptation fund or GEF or CTF, there could be a readiness hub, and this is what the recommendations are coming forward. Harmonization. So if you look at the emergence of environment and social safeguards and standards, and also proposal writing, the harmonization of all this. So GCF has their own environment social safeguards policy, whereas the other funds may have their own environment social standards and safeguards. So there could be a harmonization of safeguards and standards and proposals and proposals as well. So the other one, the second one, is the GCF and GF, and if you look at it from short term to long term, it's highlighted in green, where we could look at the GEF serving in the short term, looking at focusing on its traditional strengths like climate change, biological diversity, the organic pollutants, desertification, and so on and so forth, focusing on like pure play of climate change support in catalyzing mitigation interventions. In doing so, the GEF can complement the GCF and the CTF in supporting programmatic approaches and systematic shifts for mitigation. So this is what the GF Council would need to ensure that these funds exercises discipline and retain a sharp focus on the core strengths. And of course the GCF itself would continue to focus on impacts at scale, looking more into programmatic approaches and catalyzing systemic shifts, and to continue enhancing country ownership. The GCF could strengthen its readiness program and fund smaller interventions for national entities that need to build the capacities to handle larger amounts of funding. Again, we're looking at short term, and the fund could explore programmatic approaches for adaptation, but leave adaptation projects, say less than 10 million, to the adaptation fund and coordinate with LDCF to enhance efficiency, because LDCF again focuses on NAP, which I'll talk about in the third step. So yeah, this is it. So stakeholders largely agreed with all this discussions and analysis that the GF and GCF would serve the Paris Agreement, and that should continue. The next is the climate, CIFs, where it could, in the short term, it could begin a process looking at assuming the GCF scale up and fill key roles played by GCF funds. So if the GCF does scale up the delivery of resources over time, it could potentially absorb some of the CIF's portfolio of work. And especially critical that the GCF take up a very programmatic approach that the CIFs have played in a very important role in developing this. So when we look at the third one, sunset and work integrated into multilateral development operations and climate mainstreamed into GACF if it assumes its role. This is what the CIFs are looking at it from a short term to a long term. You would look at it. The red part is sunsetting, and the works integrated into others. Now the fourth is the adaptation fund and the LDF continue, but GCF channels this funds to adaptation fund for smaller scale adaptation projects, and the LDCF, as we know, it supports mostly national adaptation plan of actions, and this can be coordinated with the adaptation fund and the GCF. So in principle, it would be possible for GCF to absorb functions performed by the adaptation fund, but a dedicated fund for adaptation could still be proved to be adding value. And so this is what the reforms are suggesting, that the adaptation fund can be absorbed into the GCF, and the LDCF can ramp down depending on the needs. And finally, the SCCF from the short term to the long term. This is what the reforms are suggesting, that it could come into a closure over the longer period of time. Having said that, we've come to the end of this session where we've looked at the overall global climate finance architecture, diving down into cases of multilateral climate funds, the adaptation financing gaps, and some key take-home messages and reforms, and also the opportunities going into the future. I thank you for your attention and look forward to seeing you here in Bangkok.